In part one, we dealt with the fact that the root issue behind emotional wounds is actually damage to the identity, and it's what we believe about ourselves in response to something that actually produces emotional pain and gives the enemy the leverage to develop a spiritual stronghold. And that's good information because it keeps us from working on something like anxiety without getting to the root issue, which is the belief about self that's ultimately producing the anxiety in our lives. But that doesn't tell us the entire story. For example, why is it that an emotional wound can develop into something like a debilitating addiction or an eating disorder? Why is it that it can produce mood swings such that we may end up with a diagnosis of something like bipolar disorder? And most importantly, why is it that we can go for good help, whether it's therapy or ministry, but find that it actually doesn't get to the root issue that keeps reoccurring in our life? So if we want to understand this issue of brokenness, let's begin with the Bible's own view of what it calls the broken heart. I'm going to start with Isaiah 61:1 because that's the verse Jesus quoted when he said he came to bind up the brokenhearted. Now, the word brokenhearted in that verse is leb shabar. Leb means heart and shabar means broken. So the question is, what does the Old Testament mean by the term heart? And it's basically the center of who we are. You could say it's mind, emotions, and will. And shabar means this is literally divided into multiple pieces. Now, we have sayings that reflect this in our common language. Things like part of me feels one way and part of me feels another. Well, it's been actually proven in the mental health community that those parts of me can be the source of things like addictions and eating disorders. But we have other sayings like an inner child or a side to a person that can come out, that kind of thing. There's more terms for it, but all of these things are the fact that we actually do feel the brokenness in our heart, even if we don't realize what it is. Well, the New Testament shines a little bit more light on that, because when James wrote that first letter to the New Testament church, he wrote the entire letter around this same condition. All of the problems that James talks about in the church are rooted in the issue that is translated double-mindedness in the English language. Now, what's interesting about that is they had words for double-minded when James wrote the book. But the Holy Spirit, I think, wanted to drill a little bit deeper. So he inspired James to coin a new word in the Greek language that literally means double-souled. The word that James coined is dipsukos. It's di, which means two, and sukos, which means soul. In other words, two different parts of the soul. That's why he writes about things like salt and fresh water that shouldn't be coming from the same spring. It's the same root of issues that Jesus said he came to heal. So let me begin by just taking a look at what we call the heart. You know, we talk a lot about the mind versus the heart in Christianity, about truth needing to get from the mind down to the heart for it to take effect. Well, would you believe we really do have two different centers in our brain that we could call the mind and the heart? In our mind, we're very cognitive. This is where we're verbal. This is where we do a lot of just sort of regular thinking. And any effective help that you're going to get has to get from the head, where you're told what to do, to the heart, where it's more about who I am and where wounds are stored. You see, our heart is where things have to feel true. Now, the main reason that I'm going through all of this with you is that our heart processes things non-verbally. So we can pick up a lot of wounding just from the environment that we're in as we go through our childhood. And we all do pick up brokenness to some degree or another as we grow up. And all of that happens in the heart. That's where healing has to happen. So let's rewind the clock and take a look at how some of these parts of me, or these inner children, can get formed and get locked up in some of these issues. One of the most common things that people who come here tell me about is this feeling that I have to earn the right to be loved by God. That's actually rooted in one of these very young inner children, and we found a lot of this in ministry. You see, brokenness happens when we're young, when our hearts are tender and when they're developing, and that one usually happens under age 3 in homes where the parents are either emotionally distant or not nourishing. You see, as we grow up, our head gets taught, we go to school for it, but our heart has to be nourished. And if our heart doesn't get the nourishment that it needs, especially at young ages, it's kind of like a plant that doesn't get the water that it needs. It'll freeze and stop growing, and part of it will sort of get stuck or break off in that environment. Well, in the home where the parents are distant like that, what happens is a child eventually learns to sort of bid for the attention that their heart is telling them that they need. The child may act out to get attention, or they may just pull on mom's skirt. But remember, this is nonverbal. So what's happening here is something is settling in on their heart as a nonverbal reality. Their brains aren't mature enough to think this through yet. But in the nonverbal heart, it feels like I'm not going to be loved just for who I am. I have to earn the right to be loved. This causes part of the heart, since it didn't get the nourishment that it needed to develop, to get stuck in that emotional environment of that young child. So when we have an adult who still feels like they have to earn the right to be loved by God, or earn the right to be a part of a group, or whatever it may be, what's actually happening is part of their heart is stuck in the past there at 18 months old, and when it gets triggered, they're still living in those emotions. So this is what we call a part. Part of me feels one way, part of me feels another. These parts of us are stuck in the past, and this part of our heart sees the world through the wounds that caused that part to freeze or break off from me into this separate little inner child to begin with. So let me move on to another issue that can show you some of the more powerful things that the heart can carry. Let's say this woman, when she's a little bit older, experiences the unspeakable horror of sexual abuse, which is one of the most damaging things that can happen to a person. It goes right at the heart of the deepest parts of our identity, causes you to feel worthless, different from others, dirty, like you can never be healed, like you're only here to be used by people. All of that identity damage freezes the heart, keeps it from getting the nourishment that it needed to develop, and part of that young woman's heart is going to be frozen in that sexual abuse at that age. So you're going to have an inner child in there, let's say at 10 or 11 years old, that is living in the past, in the wounds, seeing the world through the eyes of a sexually abused young girl. Now, that's just part of the heart that gets frozen. The adult woman's going to move on into life, but to give you a feel for the power and why I keep saying that brokenness can carry such deep damage. In an adult woman's life who experienced sexual abuse, it's not uncommon, even if she's married to a very safe, very understanding and respectful husband, for the husband to reach over and maybe just touch her on the shoulder. And the adult woman may just reel back, almost like it was a body memory, and say, I'm sorry, you can't touch me right now. Well, that reaction didn't come from the adult part of her heart that moved on forward in life. It came from that little girl who's in there, who's still stuck in the sexual abuse. And since that little girl sees things through the eyes of those wounds, this is a man who's coming in who's going to do more of the same type of damage. You see the power of the term double-mindedness. For this to be healed, we reach the little girl and help her identity damage get healed, and the Lord will do that. I cover that in the next video. Now, let's say this girl grows a little bit older and she begins to experience some depression. The sexual abuse is mounting up. She's feeling like she has to earn the right to belong. And depression just takes over at a little bit older age. Well, that's going to be identity damage when a sense of life is hopeless, I can never be normal set in. And now that can break off another little girl who just carries hopelessness. So this can have the power of something like major depressive disorder as that hopelessness continues to compound as she grows up. But this young girl is also an adolescent, and she has a need to feel normal. Now, some people who are experiencing this develop the ability to just push the emotions down, go out there and put on a happy face, and find a way to look normal just to connect to people in their heart, because the heart has a need for that. Well, a part can break off from that, because that's also a form of identity damage that says, I have to put on a face, I can't feel my full heart to be normal. So now I've got a young child in there whose job is to be happy-go-lucky, get out, have friends, and be connected. Well, you see these two opposite extremes here, withdrawn and hopelessness, and outgoing and vivacious. This can be the root of a diagnosis of bipolar disorder. And we see this an awful lot when people come here and tell us that they have received that type of diagnosis. So let's say as this young lady grows up, maybe she's around 16 or 17 years old, she discovers alcohol, and she discovers that if she drinks enough, it numbs the pain. And the realization hits that alcohol can make me feel better, make me social, and it becomes a form of self-medication. Well, this can also be identity damage, because it says I'm not normal unless I've got something that suppresses the feelings and the pain that are in my heart. And we often find that in someone with an addiction like that, it comes from an adolescent part who has found some form of self-medication to numb the pain. Now, remember, this part is stuck in the past, sees the world through the wounds, and its emotional maturity level is that of a teenager, and teenagers really don't know enough about restraining drinking. So this part of the heart, whenever any of this pain gets triggered in the person, wants to go out and drink, and that's all it knows is drink to numb the pain. This becomes the root of an addiction. So as this woman reaches adult age, she's got these inner children in here that can be triggered, and the triggering can be so powerful that this part of your heart takes control, and you're literally immersed in this pain for a period of time, and then you come back out of it. But these triggers can continue to happen, producing double-mindedness and instability in levels that carry the deepest and most difficult issues that can occur in our lives. Now, one quick point that I want to make. The Bible talks about brokenness as a universal issue, and we've known from the mental health community now that it is. It's a matter of how severely the brokenness affects people, not whether we're broken. But only in the most extreme cases does this become dissociative identity disorder. The typical person who comes here is carrying anywhere from 18 to 22 parts, and those parts carry a range of issues. Some of them are more moderate in their life, some of them can be very severe. In the case of DID, or dissociative identity disorder, the condition has become so extreme that all of the parts are visible and they more or less see each other. It's just the most severe end of this. I wanted to make that point because there are ministries out there that call ministry to parts dissociative identity disorder, and that's not the case. This is literally just being human. It is the way God designed our hearts to hold wounds in such a way that the pain gets pushed away from us, but can also carry enough to hopefully bring us back to the Lord for healing.